Good evening, everyone. We'll just give about 10 seconds here to let everyone load. So nice to see so many familiar faces, or at least names. Ah, good crowd. Thanks for joining us, you guys. We always do, not only Inside View Press, but of course, Scott McCoy is here with us tonight. So thank you, Dr. Scott McCoy and Inside View, for both sponsoring our chats and for joining me tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and then we'll see you on the other side of your presentation.
Okay, sounds good. How is everybody tonight? I'm really, Kari says that there are a lot of you out there online. I can't see who all is participating at this point. I'm going to take her word for it. I was afraid that there wasn't going to be a single person logging on tonight with the long anticipated return of Game of Thrones tonight. I know it's recording on my TV and I'm looking forward to watching it in about an hour here. So bum, 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 we can all just sing the theme.
That's great.
So, my topic tonight that I gave a while ago was the more things change, the more they stay the same. Some thoughts on my current pedagogic practice. And it turns out that this was kind of fortuitous because it allowed me to tie this into the article that is in the current Journal of Singing that I hope many of you have taken a look at. And so our point of departure is going to be this element of the more things change, the more they stay the same. But then looking at what it is that many of us actually wind up doing in the studio. Because, you know, we live in wonderful times. There's so much stuff going on. When we think about all of the wonderful materials and techniques and technologies that we have access to that we didn't have access to 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, even longer, you know, it's a great time to be alive. We have everything. We think about the advances in technology. I'll bet that almost every one of you who is participating in this has a recording studio in your own teaching studio that exceeds just about anything that you had access to when you were a student. And we can do our own editing, we can do sound, get rid of bad noises, we can add acoustics, we can add the resonance and all that kind of stuff, and it's cheap and it's really good. We have ubiquitously available acoustic analysis. And you can put a program on your smartphone, on your laptop, on your tablet, whatever you want, and you can immediately be visualizing sound. And whether you're doing that to teach people more about how the voice is working, or if you're doing that in the specific biofeedback scheme where you're trying to help somebody actually learn how to sing better. We didn't used to have that. I mean, when I first got my computer and first got interested in this, I'm going to give you a little backstory on how I got involved with this technology and acoustic analysis. I was teaching at the University of Iowa at the time, and I think it was probably about 1993, maybe 1994. And this was in the day before faculty members at universities had computers on their desks. We actually had a thing called a secretary. And if you needed a letter typed, you went to the secretary and you dictated it. It was really cool. Now, of course, we have to do all of that all by ourselves. But I decided that I really wanted a computer on my desk. But the university wouldn't get me a computer. And so I entered a competition for a instructional computing grant, and I wrote a great little prospectus about doing acoustic analysis and told how if we had the right kind of equipment, we could put a spectrogram of Pavarotti up on the screen, and then our students could use that as a visual model and could get their own voices to sound just like Pavarotti's. Of course, that didn't work. My department chair thought it was a marvelous prospectus, but he also said there's no way possible that this is going to be funded, but it was funded. And I got my computer and I got interested in all of this technology stuff and what we can see and how we can translate that to what our students are doing. And it really has revolutionized not just my teaching, but more specifically my teaching of teachers. And I think that's really the most important aspect of that from my perspective. The advances we've seen in medicine. Think about how different voice care is now than it was 30 years ago. Remember the times when we'd send a student to the ENT for some hoarseness, and the doctor stuck a mirror in the person's throat and looked down there and said, "Oh, no, 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 you have nodules. 3 months of voice rest." It didn't work, but we did it anyway, and eventually people just stopped singing. But now we know so much more, and things that we thought had to be treated surgically, we now realize that we can treat with really good therapy and have better and faster outcomes. Our world is changing very fast. The advances that we've made in cognition, what we know about learning skills, both procedural and declarative, the know how versus the know what, the motor learning skills. These were things that nobody talked about when I was learning how to teach. And now it is really a vital part of what we do. When we think about the changes in the diversity of our field, and here I'm not just talking about the diversity of people. I mean, the people that we have in our field it's marvelous. We have people who are singers and musicians of every persuasion and skin tone and preference, and it's just really cool. We get to rub shoulders with everybody. But then that also goes on to how the musical and vocal styles that we are exposed to have expanded exponentially in recent times. I mean, when I was starting out, nobody was hiring people to teach music theater or commercial music skills. And now it's pretty hard to find a job notice that doesn't include an expectation of being able to teach unamplified singing. Advances in communication, social media, live streaming of concerts, and then, of course, everything that we have learned in voice science and the stuff that is new from when we perhaps were learning about voice science ourselves. The ascendancy of nonlinear source filter theory over our traditional linear theories, where we just looked for a formant and then tried to match a pitch to a formant, and that was that. Or the multi-mass models of vocal fold oscillation that help us realize that the Bernoulli principle is important, but it isn't the exclusive important thing as voice teachers once were taught. Remember when the Bernoulli effect was all that you needed to make the vocal folds oscillate? And that was terrific, because all we needed to do then was supply the right kind of breath and everything else took care of itself. But now science has shown us that there's a lot more to it than that. Vibrational modes, all these wonderful things. It's a great time to be alive. We know so much stuff. And in fact, you might argue that we know too much stuff. We know so much stuff now that we have to figure out what we can ignore and what is really so important to us that we must incorporate it to help our singers sing better. Now, my pedagogic reality. This may come as a surprise to some of you. These are things that I do not do. I don't have a spectrogram running at all times. In fact, I would guess that in a typical year in my teaching, I maybe take 2 or 3 students into my voice lab for a total elapsed time of under 5 minutes to look at very specific things.
Wow, interesting.
This is a place where I take great comfort in one of the things that our great friend Ken Bozeman mentions in his newest book, The Kinesthetic Voice Pedagogy, where he reminds us that if you as a teacher can't make acoustic adjustments and help your student with all of those acoustic things by ear and sight, just by what you can tell by looking and listening to your student, you probably aren't going to be able to do it if you look at a computer screen either. And so while that computer might help us to learn what to listen for, it doesn't substitute for actually doing the listening. I almost never take somebody in and hook them up to my EGG machine unless we're in a pedagogy class and we're doing specific measurements to understand how the voice works. Now, I will say, I'm quite happy to admit that in the course of my teaching, I've had several students, particularly young women, who I have not been 100% sure whether they were in a chest voice or a head voice.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have used my EGG in those to look at some contact quotients and to get a better idea what they're actually doing.
Huh.
But that's just for my edification. It's not to make the student a better singer. I can just go right around the corner of my door and I've got a wonderful instrument that monitors airflow rates and subglottic pressures. Almost never use it. Because again, if the student has to rely on that to correct what they're doing, they're not going to be able to sing very well. It's a trigger. I rarely calculate form and frequencies of individual singers, and yet I am always subtly adjusting vowels to make the formants tune better and to get a more efficient sound. I certainly don't teach in the language of science. I don't talk about pressures. I don't talk about formants. I talk about music for the most part, and I talk about getting a sound quality that underscores the music and allows effective communication. And I never eschew the use of images, metaphors, kinesthetics, misdirection, or even blatantly false information about physiology and acoustics. Yes, sometimes I lie to my students. I tell them to do things that are physiologically or acoustically impossible. Now, I am pretty sure that I don't ever do that thinking that what I'm telling them is true, because I think there's a big difference in us believing the stuff that we make up and understanding that we are making it up for a purpose and that we are doing a means to an end, which is efficient teaching. So what do I do? I actually use my voice very little during a lesson. If I have a long teaching day, which for me, I think my longest teaching day is 5 hours, and usually I have no more than 3 hours of teaching. But if I get to the end of the day and I were to need to sing a rehearsal or something, I would need a half an hour to 45 minutes of warm up just to get my voice ready to go, because I have used it so little during my teaching that it isn't ready for vigorous singing. I do virtually no modeling.
Hmm.
When I was younger, I probably did some, I did, no, not probably, I know that I did more modeling. But, I'm 64 years old now. My students aren't 64 years old. And I really don't want my students listening to me and then trying to sing like a 64-year-old tenor. That's not who they are. And so if I just plain don't model, there's no risk of that. We use other methods. And I avoid what I call pedagogic piling on.
Hmm.
My goal is always to, when we stop, to focus in on just one thing, maybe sometimes two things, but really just going for one really basic element and then allowing the student multiple attempts to figure out how to apply what we have just talked about. Because we have all been in those lessons where a student sings something and we hear something we want to fix, and we stop and we work at fixing it and we go back and do it again and it's unfixed. And so we stop and we refix it, and they do it again and it's unfixed, and we refix it without giving them the chance to realize that, oh, that same kind of thing happened another 4 or 5 times during the song, and maybe by the time we got to the end they would have gotten it figured out. And you know what? They're smart. An awful lot of the times they do. I try to remember at all times that students learn by singing, not by talking about singing. And that's something that I find myself often revisiting in comments that I write about people whose teaching I am observing, whether that is for a tenure and promotion screening or job interview, or, whatever it may be, that we have, face it, we have teachers who suffer from logorrhea, diarrhea of the mouth. And in that course of a 55-minute lesson, some days their singers might only sing actually for 3 or 4 minutes during the course of that time. The rest of the time is spent gabbing. They are not singing that. And then finally, I really strive to integrate all of my technical and musical training into a unified method that really illustrates the interdependence of the two elements. What's the point of making a beautiful sound if you can't make beautiful music with it? And what's the point of being an expressive musician if your technique is too poor to be able to give you a reliable instrument to make the sounds that you hear in your mind? And so I'm after this Gestalt training that integrates everything right from the beginning. And that means that they're singing. They, right from the start, they are singing entire songs. When we start working on a group of songs, very shortly in the period of working on it, we do the entire set without stop. We do entire song cycles. I have a young tenor who just sang his first Schöne Müllerin, and the first time he sang the work from start to finish was probably 3 months before the performance, the first performance that he did, simply because that is such a key element of learning the music and learning the voice of the music that we have to do it. We have to do it a lot. Now, my observations on the current state of singing teaching, or the teaching of singing, are based on what is admittedly my own very narrow view of the field of singing. Some of you are in situations that are similar to mine, but I would wager that most of you are not. About 80% of my students, at least, are in graduate programs or are already singing professionally. So I am dealing with very few undergraduate students, and it's been years since I worked with a high schooler. And I would say that more than 80% of my students are focusing exclusively on unamplified classical singing. Every now and then they may cross over and do some music theater for a specific purpose, but I don't have people who are wanting to be jazz singers, who are wanting to be CCM singers, who are wanting to pursue any of these other really wonderful, wonderful opportunities that singers have in our contemporary world. So since my students aren't coming to me for that instruction, I have not really needed to learn how to teach in that manner. And that works for me at this point. It doesn't work for my charges who are graduating and going out and starting to teach in the academy. They have to do all the stuff that I have not had to do. Okay. Now, I also admit that I don't have a big studio. I maybe work with a dozen kids at a time, which means that I can actually remember who they are when they come to see me the next week, which is really nice. And I can even remember what music they're doing. And I spend a lot of time every year visiting with prospective students and teaching sample lessons. And here's where I start having some issues because of the alarming consistency of the technical, musical, vocal, and linguistic deficiencies that I am routinely seeing in this cohort. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, the rest of this brief prelude to our talk tonight is based on my current article in the Journal of Singing, which is in itself based on a composite student whose features show the main characteristics that unfortunately are sometimes seeming to be ubiquitous among this cohort of potential graduate students who are coming to my door. Now, these are elements that when I talk with the students about, almost to a person, these are things that the student is aware of and things that have been addressed with their teacher. But they have yet to succeed in actually making the corrections or making the technical changes that would allow them to conquer these elements that are standing in their way. I think that there are a lot of reasons that this happens. One of the big ones is that we are in this system where students need to be getting up and singing in public very quickly. And oftentimes they are required to be performing before they have figured out how to play their instruments. Now, can you imagine a violinist going to university and picking up a violin for the first time in his first lesson? And now he's going to be a violin major. And this is a person who has never even held a bow, has never even figured out where first position is on the fingerboard, but now is taking violin lessons, is going to be a violin major. And so the violin teacher says, yes, I think it's probably time for us to start working on the Brahms concerto. That would be a great first piece for you. Can you imagine? But you know what? Isn't that pretty much what we do with so many of our singers? Yeah, we go to 24 Italian songs and arias and we pull out Ciao Sole dal Gange. That is not an easy piece. In fact, it's a wickedly difficult piece. And so we've got this element of people needing to use their voices before they know how to use their voices. And we have these students who are succeeding at what they're attempting to do. They are winning roles, they're getting A's on their juries, they're passing all of their exams, they're winning competitions. They go to NATS and they come back with a superior rating. And so when the teacher says, you know, we've really got to fix that breathing of yours, there's a part in the student's brain that says, yeah, maybe I need to do that, but you know, if I really start working on that, it might screw up my technique. And it'll take a while for me to get back into balance. And I've got all these things to sing. So I really need to wait to fix that until I don't have so much to sing, because I don't want it to screw me up. Well, guess what? In making that decision, that student is likely self-selecting to put a limit on his or her singing that is going to be a really hard ceiling on how much they are able to accomplish. We've got to work out those technical things to be able to actually sing and make music. So this brings me to my 5 things to keep in our minds at all times pedagogically. Thing number 1, breath. Gee, surprise, surprise, surprise. Who would ever thought that breathing is important for singing? Well, it is. And it's all about pressure and flow. We've got a lot of misconceptions about breathing, many of which come because the breathing apparatus is relatively well hidden in our body, and because much of what we experience in breathing is secondary to what's actually happening. For example, we feel our belly protrude sometimes when we inhale. Now, we think that that's the air going in. Well, it is, but that's not where the air is going in. The air is obviously going into our lungs, which are much higher, and we're just pushing out our insides to make more room for the air that is going up higher. Okay, but so when we talk about breath and we're looking at our students, we have 2 issues. We've got a pressure issue and we've got a flow issue. And that pressure issue is either that there is going to be too much or too little air pressure below the glottis that is being produced by the pulmonary system. And the flow then is either going to be too little or too much if there is something wrong. Now, obviously, our goal is that the pressure and the flow are going to be just right. But that can be really tricky to do if a person is not playing his or her body in a good manner. If we're seeing a heaving chest or shoulders, that good old high breath, remember that that's not bad because it takes in too little air. It's bad because it generates too much pressure and it's too hard to regulate. Look for locked abdominal muscles. Does the belly shake when the person sings? Or when going for high notes or loudness, can you see that the person is just really flexing like they're trying to do a crunch with a 50-pound weight sitting on top of their chest? Are we seeing men who are breathing like a woman normally breathes, or vice versa? Notice that women tend to breathe lower in their torsos than men do, except that oftentimes women who have studied with men tend to breathe like men, and men who have studied with women often try to breathe like women. And in neither case does that usually work to their advantage. So, what do? We need to teach cause and effect in breathing. Remember that Boyle's law is at play here, and that we inhale because we make ourselves get bigger. We don't get bigger because we inhale because we get bigger. We exhale because we get smaller. Now, do you realize what that means? It means that if we can get or induce in our students the physical expansion that we are looking for inhalation, whether that be a thoracic expansion in the lower part of the thorax, a place of expansion in the umbilical region or in the epigastric region or in the hypogastric region or in the back, any of those places, we can physically expand without breathing. But if we expand while we breathe better. So breathing, it's not rocket science. And it is not also something that we can afford to give up on. If our student isn't seeming to get it, don't stop until they do, because we're going to see with all of these 5 things that they are sequential. And if we don't build this up from a solid foundation, we're on a house of cards and everything is never going to work as well as it could. Thing 2, larynx. Where is it? We have an epidemic in the classical singing world of HLD, high larynx disease. Happens to be a precursor to MTD, muscular tension dysphonia. Now, I'm very specifically talking about unamplified singing here, the kind of singing that classical singers have been trained in for a long, long time, that gives us the ability to project over an orchestra in a large hall without having electronic amplification or any other kind of amplification. In that singing, it is advantageous to have a larynx which rests in a neutral position. It's not depressed, it's not elevated. It is in a neutral position. And we have the ability to slightly alter that position so that we can lift it a couple of millimeters or lower it a couple of millimeters as we might need to optimize our resonance. But what we shouldn't do ever is allow our students, male and female, to sing with a perpetually elevated laryngeal position. Now, we need to be creative in figuring out how to make that not happen. One of the ways that I like to use right now is a panting exercise, where I will simply have the student pant like a puppy. You can all try that. Okay, now pant like you're a little chihuahua, little itty bitty dog. Notice how high the pitch goes? Now pant like you are a St. Bernard. Okay. Now put your finger on your larynx and pant like that chihuahua. Now pant like the St. Bernard. What'd you feel?
Lower larynx.
Different, right? Your larynx was high when you panted like the little dog, and it was low when you panted like the big dog. So if we got a student who is chronically elevating the larynx right as singing starts, start with a big dog pant, and then just phonate a relatively low pitch and work from there. If that larynx is elevating when pitch goes up, absolutely don't even consider starting to deal with anything like registration or getting a man into his upper extension or his head voice or getting that woman into a whistle voice or whatever. Until that larynx is stabilized, anything that you do is just putting a Band-Aid on the bigger problem. And yes, you might get it to sound better, but you're never going to get it to sound as good as it possibly could. Don't cave in. If the larynx is in the wrong place, the technique is false, and it isn't going to work. Fix it. Thing 3, the jaw. May the force not be with you. Remember, jaw closing muscles are way stronger and more efficient than jaw opening muscles. You realize that as you are sitting right there now in front of your computer, you could stick your index finger in your mouth and bite the end clean off right through the bone. Your teeth are plenty hard enough, your jaw muscles are plenty strong enough. Now, you don't do that because your brain won't let you. But if you had to, you could. By comparison, the muscles that open the jaw are relatively weak and suffer a bigger problem in that they are pulling the jaw down by pulling it against the hyoid bone. Remember that the hyoid bone is free to move around. So if your jaw muscles are tight, then when you try to lower your jaw, you're probably going to wind up tugging on your hyoid bone and getting your larynx out of position and getting into some other things that we just really don't want. Now, It's hard to tell sometimes when you got a jaw problem or a tongue problem. And guess what? Probably doesn't matter. One of them is going to be the ringleader, but they almost always are both involved. And when you fix one, there's a good chance that you're going to fix the other one as well. Remember that a free jaw does not wiggle up and down in sync with vibrato. If you've got an 18, 19-year-old soubrette soprano and she's singing Vedrai Carino and her jaw is just going to town, it's not right. Fix it. It's not a developmental stage. Fix it. And you got to figure out a way to allow that person to do something else with the jaw. One of the things I really like, I call the jaw juggle, where the jaw is wiggled from side to side, not up and down. Let's try that one. Just gently cradle your jaw in your hand, and then using your muscles, move your jaw to the left, unhinging it, and move it to the right, and then move it back and forth. And see how quickly you can wiggle it back and forth from side to side. Now do that when you're singing. Your students who have tight jaws will start an exercise that ascends, and at the bottom of the scale, they'll be just fine wiggling that jaw from side to side. Someplace they'll get toward the top, and all of a sudden everything just locks down into position, and the jaw is no longer free. We've got to get it going. So do not, again, make sure that this is something that you actually address. The tongue. Sometimes the tongue is the bigger offender. I've got things that I love to do to get the tongue to help release a little bit. I do a toodle-a-waddle exercise. Toodle-a-waddle, 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 too. And that it's important there as you do that the lips are moving a lot, that the tongue is moving a lot, and that the jaw is moving a lot. Because if you are tightening the muscles, you will crash and burn on that exercise. It won't work. Or wee won't work. And one of my favorites, unique New York, 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 unique New York. Wait, try that one. Isn't that fun? You just have to not laugh at yourself when you wind up saying unique New York, unique New York, unique New York, or whatever. Negative practice. Got a person who's having problems with tongue. Well, let's see what comes out when you really tighten that tongue. Get that tongue just as absolutely tight as you can possibly make it. And see what it feels like. Because you know what the absolute worst thing to do to try to get that tongue to relax is to say, relax your tongue. You know, Susie, your tongue is really tight. You would sound so much better if you just released that tongue. Let's do it again now and really relax your tongue, especially the back of your tongue. Come on, let's do it. No. Relax, not tighter, relax. Find another way. You want the back door in. And finally, thing number 5, the palate. Look, folks, the palate is just a little valve that prevents food and liquid from going up your nose when you swallow. It is not this majestic cathedral dome of resonance that is provided so that we can sing, woo! No, it's just a valve. And everybody who is physiologically intact should be able to control that valve. It's a small movement, just a few millimeters for the most part. And it's something that there are dead giveaways that show that you can control your palate. If you can blow up a balloon, you can control your soft palate. If you can blow out a birthday candle, if you can play the flute or a recorder or a trumpet, any of those things require you to raise your soft palate. I mean, sometimes try blowing up a balloon without lifting your soft palate and letting air up your nose. It ain't gonna work. Okay? Now, we also have to accept that nasality is an aesthetic choice that some people enjoy and others are offended by. It's not a technical requirement. I've spoken with a number of people who have insisted that some nasality is absolutely essential because of how it reduces back pressure in the mouth. Because when you're singing, if your nose isn't open, there's just going to be so much pressure back in there that you're not going to be able to sing. Really? how much pressure do we actually use? And you know what? When your mouth is open, there isn't any pressure on the inside of your mouth. It's just, it goes to atmospheric pressure right away. So, there are just a lot of things that sort of can be nonsense. But so it's something to fix. It's something we can fix. It's something that we need to fix. Other stuff, building an instrument versus teaching singing. We as singing teachers are relatively unique in the field of music making. How many violinists do you know that built their own instrument? I know some harpsichord players who built their own instrument, maybe some dulcimer players who built their own instrument, but I don't know a whole lot of violinists who are master luthiers who really built their own instrument and then learned how to play it. We have the challenge that we are, in some aspects, actually building the instrument while we are simultaneously learning how to play it. And we're building an instrument that is invisible to us, and an instrument that is largely built of component parts that are not necessarily under our direct control. And so we do have elements of simply needing to learn how to make noise on our instruments, how to coordinate so that we can get a tone started, get it stopped, get it sustained, to keep vibrato in balance, to sing a wide range of pitches in tune and with a scale that is aesthetically pleasing. All elements of just plain making noise. But then we also have to figure out how to convert those noises into expressive music making, expressive singing. And that's the challenge, because we have to be able to figure out how to find repertoire that challenges our students intellectually and artistically, but yet is suited for the current state of their instrument. In the article that I wrote, The Five Things, I tell a little story about a family who is going to buy a violin for their high school student who has been studying violin for a long time. And the teacher announces at some point that it's time to move on to a much better instrument because the student instrument that you're playing on is going to limit your ability to play the instrument. So they go to the violin shop and they look at a whole bunch of instruments, and there is one that the student just absolutely has his heart set on. He loves it. And then they look at it and look at the price tag, and family realizes that there is just no possibility that they can afford this beautiful instrument, which is so important for their student to become a better player. So the violin maker comes up with an idea. He says, I've got this instrument in the back that it's going to be really, really good, but it's not finished yet. But if you want to take it now, you can start working on it now. It's got a top and it's got the sides. The back isn't on yet, and it only has 3 strings that are playable. But it'll give you a good feeling for it. And then as you get more money, you can buy more pieces and have it more added onto it, and eventually you'll get the full violin. And so the student goes to the teacher, and one more time, the teacher says, "Oh, wonderful, we've got a good instrument. Let's play Brahms." That's what we do with our singers. It's like the student that I had who was a freshman who came in and announced that she wanted to learn how to sing the Liebestod. Now, this was a girl who, up to this point, had not been able to sing Caro mio ben with the right notes and words. But she thought she was ready for the Liebestod. And when I asked her about that, she said, "Yeah, but I already know how to sing." We had a difference of opinion. So, the more things change, the more they stay the same. We've got a lot of things that can help us. But you know what? If we will focus on the basics, we'll probably all become the best possible teachers that we can do, that we can be. And with that, I welcome your feedback and your insights and your questions and comments.
Well, thank you. That was not only educational, but highly entertaining. So thank you for that. And I'm actually curious, when you say the more things change, the more they stay the same, I thought you might take that in a different direction. Based on what you were talking about, this deficiency that you're noticing
Yes.
with your incoming potential graduate students, are you thinking that things are staying the same and that we're still not doing a good enough job as a profession of getting these basics taught to our students?
I think that can be a problem, and it is definitely a problem in some circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
I am really hesitant to lay any blame or credit for that issue. But my supposition is that it isn't the result of inferior teaching.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the result of teachers who are poorly educated and poorly trained. I think it is more likely to be an issue of our expectations have become so diverse and go in so many different areas that maybe we're not allowing our students the time they need to develop those critical skills because they're having to apply them in too many areas early on.
Mm-hmm. Asking too much of them too young.
Right. I
So,
mean, our freshmen come in. How many of you are teaching in a school where that freshman at the end of one semester has to get up and sing a jury with 5, maybe 7 songs memorized?
right.
And maybe what that person actually needed to do was spend the entire semester just singing slow grand scales.
Yeah. And we have that issue. We're on quarter system.
Yeah.
So
So that
every 10 weeks. Yeah. So Nicholas Prentice says, so how can we, as the expectation setters, do better?
Hmm. Um, that's a wonderful question, Nick. Uh, and I think that the better there comes through awareness. And whether that is looking for the way in with our individual students that will facilitate their generalization of skills so that they can get from that point of making noise to making music and doing it in an efficient way. And that's where, as teachers, some of our understanding of science can really help us. But again, that's only dealing with the noise making issue.
Not the musicianship and the artistry.
And
Um,
so, and if we think about it, if we look at the repertoire that an undergraduate is likely to encounter over a 4-year program, in your traditional music school, that person is going to sing a selection of works in Italian, German, French, English, maybe a couple of things in Spanish. They'll do a few arias depending on what their voice is like. They might do some oratorio stuff. They'll probably do some music theater stuff. They'll do the stuff that they do privately that they oftentimes don't even want their teacher to know about. The a cappella group that they secretly sing with, or the karaoke stuff that they're doing. And so they've got a lot going on. And we add then into that their music that they're doing in choirs, the music that they're doing in opera workshop, in opera productions, and music theater productions with their church choir that they're singing for, and all of this other stuff. And they're being pulled in so many directions that sometimes it's just really difficult to become that master of one thing.
those
That's
are, I'm sorry.
sorry, but these,
To me, I'm hearing you say that's an issue. There's an issue of their time and expectations of their time being the
yes,
issue.
yes.
But is the issue, and you maybe not want to say, as you said earlier, emphatically, but is there an issue in teaching? Do you think there's still, in a profession that's unregulated, and we don't need to go down that rabbit hole, although I wouldn't mind hearing your opinion in this forum, right? Are we ever going to be able to control what our teachers know?
Not if it's not regulated.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. So
And,
is that an equal issue, I guess, is my question to you, as much as the time pull?
yeah, it might be. You know, it is in many ways still the wild, wild west out there, with anybody being able to hang out a shingle and say that you are a voice teacher.
Yeah.
And you know, in terms of that licensing or regulation side, it is worth our remembering that we are one of the few professions that are engaged in an activity that can create physical injury. And yet we have no oversight or expectation of a core body of knowledge that everybody has. And you can't groom a dog without a license,
Right. Right.
but you can supposedly teach somebody how to sing without a
Yeah.
license. Um, but I also have to assume that many of these students that I am getting who haven't quite figured it out yet are working with competent teachers that know this stuff and just have been unable in the time that they have with the student to make the lasting impression, to develop those technique things that can then enable the beautiful music making that that student might be capable of.
Hmm. Are you more concerned that we might be lacking basics of functional singing teaching, or that we're lacking in teaching artistry and musicianship?
Both, both
Okay.
in both in equal measure.
Okay. That's what
Yeah,
I.
I think that's something that extends well beyond our voice studios.
Hmm.
Uh, when your student comes and complains about a sight singing test that they just had in the last hour, and you come to discover that they were given all of the examples in advance and got to practice them. Well, that's not sight singing.
Right.
And so there, in many ways, the world continues to change. Um, Now, I can understand why we might not have to teach the same core knowledge in things like musicology and music history that we used to, because you can just Google everything and it's right there at your fingertips instantly. But if you've got to play an interval into your phone to figure out that it's a perfect fourth, you've got problems. And it doesn't matter there if you're a violinist or a singer, you got problems. So the part of what I am seeing is a manifestation of the fact that singers just have to know so much.
That's true. And teachers, yes.
Singers and their teachers. I
Mhm.
steadfastly maintain that singing teachers need to know more than any other music teachers, applied music teachers, and that singers need to know more than other musicians.
Mhm. Yeah. We're getting some great questions, but before I turn it over to my wonderful attendees, I have one more that I really want to know from you. Semantics, right? And I love your semantic minefield, which I borrow all the time. Where are we as a profession, and is it important that we have agreement in basics of language, not imagery, right? Because the imagery is open for interpretation. But how important do you think it is that we find agreement in language for our profession?
I think that would be. I think that's a noble goal. It's a lofty goal. I'm not sure that it is something that we will ever achieve because we we get connected and committed to our language. I remember a dear colleague who just really abhorred the word vibrato because thought that messed things up. So instead of talking about vibrato, he talked about shimmer.
Mm-hmm.
And wonderful. But the problem is that shimmer actually has a finite definition in the voice world.
Right.
So if you choose to use alternative language, then you are always having to explain yourself. But if we could all simply someday come to the agreement that mode one is the vibrational source behind registration events that we call blah, 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 then we are at least getting to the point where we've got something in common and there are fewer people who need to make things up.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, let's go through a few of these questions. Janine Dodd. Hi, Janine. Working with she works mainly with high school singers, and she sees a lot of the high larynx issue, and she loved your panting exercise and just wondered if you had any other advice on dealing with that issue.
Again, it's perseverance is the main thing. And this is one where I find that biofeedback is really helpful. Just that finger on top of the larynx to remind people of where it is. But the other thing that is a factor that we sometimes forget about is that when a student learns how to sing with the larynx not lifting up into a high position, that person's voice sounds very different inside his or her body.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, inside the singer, it is a radically different sound. To us, it's a subtly different sound. We hear improvement in the sound usually. There's more color, there's more bass. It's just, it's a more complete sound. But inside the singer, it oftentimes just feels like it's something completely foreign and false. That you are pretending to be something that you are not being and that you are using somebody else's voice. And in these cases, I find that taking the person into a really hyper live acoustic, I take them into the restroom right next door to my office or into the stairwell where there is so much acoustic feedback that they can really hear what is going out into the world. They can hear more than they actually hear what's coming through their bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And they can actually get that feedback that says, oh, this feels very different, but it still sounds like me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the big problem. They don't want to sound like somebody else. They want to sound like me. And so if we can get them to understand that, yes, you still sound like you, then we've got a tool to work at that. There's also an issue of trying to hurry things along too much.
Mm-hmm.
It might be that you need to spend several weeks not extending much beyond 3 or 4 pitches. If there are only 3 or 4 pitches that can be sung with everything in the mechanism in the right kind of stable balance, then that's where you start. Because if you're trying to make something sound better with the core technique still not being right, yeah, you'll get it to sound better. But it's never going to be as good as it could be.
Mm-hmm. Great. Colin Johnson says, in trying to stay focused on 1 or 2 technical aspects in a lesson, I find I'm repeating myself a lot or varying what I'm saying slightly. Some students seem to become impatient before the aspect has been improved. How do we keep it from getting too repetitive?
Have them sing more. Long is, it's repetitive if you're singing the same 3 measures over and over and over again and trying to fix the same thing in those same 3 measures. But realizing that people don't know how to do something correctly until they do it right the first time, not on the 3rd or the 4th time that they attempt it. And so by keeping them singing and repeating, whether it's an exercise or whole songs or whatever, that are going to keep revisiting similar issues, they get multiple chances at first attempts and eventually can get to the point where they are proactive in making the adjustment that they need before they come to the event, rather than realizing that, oh, I just did it wrong again.
Love that. Okay, Linda Rose Linnebach says, "Hi Scott, would you please explain or speak a little bit more about your comment about women breathing is different for women and men? Functional anatomy does not support a difference based on gender. The function of the lungs, diaphragm, rib cage can certainly vary from individual. Minor structural differences, but is not variable because of gender."
Yeah, except that it is. The female and male adult pelvis is shaped differently. That is a very important physiologic difference. And because of that difference, the musculature of the pelvis is also different. And there are differences in proportions. And well, you can make the argument that a body is a body. I think that there's probably a reason why when you read the pedagogic books that have been written by women and compare them to the pedagogic books that have been written by men, almost all the women describe the breathing in one way, and almost all the men describe breathing in another way. And the women do it all in the same way, and the men do it all in the same way. You find men talking almost exclusively about expansion and control coming from the epigastric region, and the majority of women writers talk about it being in the hypogastric region or the pelvic region. And realistically, there aren't a whole lot of men that have a bunch of pelvic sensation in breathing when they're singing. And I would also wager that there aren't a whole lot of women who don't feel something.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are differences.
Great question. Thank you for that. Leanne Skaggs says, when you're working with a student to consistently achieve the relaxed laryngeal position, do you typically stick with specific vowels such as O or U instead of ah and E?
No. But what I do is work with whatever vowel happens to be working best for that individual student. And that may change depending on the student. I don't find that there is anything intrinsic in a vowel sound that would necessarily lead to a higher or lower larynx position. But that said, almost everybody has vowels that work better for that person individually. And you know, it's the discovery of finding what is already working and going from that rather than focusing on what isn't working and trying to fix it. Find what does work and extend it.
Mm-hmm. Jennifer Rogers asks, how do you handle color and placement kinds of words like warm, bright, forward, tall, etc.? They fall into concepts that are so variable in our interpretation but seem hard to replace.
Mm-hmm. Yep. In those things, I find those to be very useful, especially when the term is generated by the student.
Mm.
I will hear a sound that is different than has been made habitually by that student, and I will ask the student, what did that feel like to you? What did that sound like to you? What was your awareness of it? Was it different in any way from this sound? And then when they come up with the words and the means of describing the sensations, it actually has some meaning for them. Because there's no reason in the world that they should be feeling the same things that I do.
Thank you for that. Okay, I want to ask just a couple more. We're at the top of our hour, but Michelle says, do you have a weekly voice class? And if so, do you ever present issues such as these to your class in lieu of having your singers sing? Do you think this approach might enhance learning and serve some lesson time and save some lesson time?
It's a great question. And I would say that, first of all, I actually have the great good fortune to have 2 studio classes each week. So I wind up seeing all of my students for an hour just by themselves, but then another 2 hours in studio classes. And with only a dozen students, and between my piano skills and having access to some other pretty decent pianists, just about everybody sings in every single class. So
wow.
a lot of experience getting up and singing in front of people.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, we do talk about these specific concepts and how they manifest, and how when a student makes an adjustment, what the perceived difference is to the other listeners in the room, so that they are getting a variety of opinions on how the sound is impacting the ears of the listener. And it isn't just me reinforcing that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I know some people use masterclass time and they don't talk about technique. They use it only to discuss. But I, like you, I find it such an incredible opportunity to get feedback from technical issues.
Not talk about technique.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear you say that. I feel like I need to apologize for that sometimes. So thank you. Um,
An awful lot of what we are doing in terms of interpretation and music making is completely reliant on
mhm.
having the right technical foundation to be able to do it. And
You're
so you got to talk about both ends.
choir. You're preaching to the choir for sure. One last question, because Dan Mitten was so kind to write a whole bunch of questions on Facebook for me to ask, which we did not get to any. But he wants to know, what is your favorite classic pedagogy resource?
My favorite classic pedagogy course.
Drum roll, please. That is tough.
That is tough. Um, hmm. And I would say that for graduate men, my most important pedagogic research is probably Schubert songs.
Wow, that is not what we expected, I don't
No,
think.
it's not what you expected. Um,
Wow.
and that, that shows that my own teaching, the wedding of musicianship and technique is so thorough they just cannot be separated. I just bored as anything very quickly trying to exclusively work on technique. That's just making good noises. Big deal. Got to use your good noises to make good music.
Hmm.
And work from that. So,
Fascinating.
yeah, I find tremendous value in Richard Miller's books.
Hmm.
In in there are loads of wonderful pedagogic resources,
Hmm.
but ultimately, our students learn to sing not from reading a book or being told what to do. They learn to sing by making music with their voices.
Hmm.
And we have to select music for them that is going to teach them how to sing.
What do you think Garcia, Bernard, Lehman would think of where we've arrived in 2019?
I think they'd be thrilled and appalled
Why would they? I know why they'd be thrilled, I perceive, but why would they be appalled?
because of we're in such a hurry.
Hmm.
Remember when Garcia was working with people back in
Yeah.
those days? A student would move into the house and have a lesson every day,
Yeah.
and they had the luxury of spending a long time just figuring out how to play the instrument and not being tasked with making music on the instrument.
Yeah, that's interesting. Even
Well,
Lehman, didn't she say years? They shouldn't sing for 6 or 7 years or something,
yeah, they didn't sing music. They sang vocalises, many
right?
of which were pieces of music. So there was music making in that way, but
Hmm.
it wasn't the same kind of performance oriented or goal oriented performance that we are facing so regularly now.
Hmm. Fascinating. Well, what a wonderful time to share with you tonight, Scott. I thank you for your generosity. And I know you're eager to get to Game of Thrones. Thank
Yeah.
you all for sacrificing Game of Thrones to be with us tonight. We had good attendance. So go and enjoy, and we'll see you again soon.
Okay. Bye,
Oh, and
everybody. Have a good
bye,
evening.
everyone. See you in May.
Okay. Bye, Kari.
Bye-bye, Scott.
Let's see if I can do this. Jane presenter. Oops.